Hello and welcome to this screencast on Societies at Crossroads, Chapter 31 from Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. The Societies at Crossroads refers to four empires as they existed in the 19th century primarily. So we have a focus on four different places, so foci, if you will. And so obviously comparison will be one of the skills that students will use. Also, these societies were at a crossroads. They had decisions to make about how to proceed. So there will be continuity and change. And of course, also causation. Why did they choose what they did and what effect did it have? In short, this chapter is an excellent opportunity for historical reasoning. So here we see the four societies. So before reading, students might want to review or just think about what they already know about the Ottoman, Russian, Chinese, and Japanese empires. And they would all be empires because they had emperors, and especially the first three had territories beyond sort of their traditional heartlands. With China, this would be the Qing dynasty that we're looking at. Here's the big idea. Industrialization and global capitalism created advantages for some countries in the global order that were reinforced by imperialism and attempts to dominate other societies. All four of the civilizations in this chapter were faced with the dilemma of how should they respond to this while maintaining their traditional culture, which served as legitimacy for the government and identity for the empire. Industrialization meant that countries with capital had advantages over countries with less capital. Remember, capital means funds to invest, and those funds produced more efficient production, and that production then, being more efficient, lowered prices, and it meant that goods from the capitalist countries could outcompete goods from other countries, at least like for mass produced products. You should know there's still artisanally produced luxury goods coming out of many of these societies. So, from India and China, Japan are all producing things that are luxury goods. But in terms of mass production and the industrial economy, factory made products rule. So this is going to have a big effect on those places. In short, Japan did transition to industrialization more so than the other three countries. But we can overdraw this point because Russia, the Ottoman Empire especially, and Egypt and China all began industrializing. Okay, why am I saying it like this? Well, because often students will overgeneralize, lose the complexity of the situation. And often this is egged on by textbooks. So you want to be careful as you're reading through a book to not draw too dramatic of a conclusion. Russia had the world's longest railroad. Ottoman Egypt produced cotton cloth. China had factories and a modern industrial city in Shanghai. So we have that. But all three of those places were still behind in a sense. And behind doesn't mean it's going to be hard to catch up. When I say behind, I mean they weren't at the same place as, say, Britain. But it's not really like a race because British capital was being invested in these places, like in Ottoman Egypt. So it's essentially impossible to catch up because of the way that capitalism structured international relations. Now, Japan succeeding wasn't as complete of a change as it seems because Japan had a tradition of textile manufacturing that continued through and into the industrial era. But in general, Japan successfully industrialized in the sense that they became an imperialist power themselves, whereas these other three places were more vulnerable to imperialist incursion by industrial powers. And so that's what this is about, looking at imperialism, which will be the subject of the next chapter, chapter 32. But you'll be able to see this happening already here in chapter 31. So imperialism means forming an empire. So the industrializing states establish new kinds of overseas empires. And in the cases that are here, Those did not involve new colonies, but did involve spheres of influence, protectorates, other kinds of more complex, or at least on the face, more complex imperialist relations. So the British and then later the French and the Japanese established spheres of influence in China. So China was still an independent country, but it lost complete sovereignty over its territory. So, for instance, British citizens in the British sphere of influence could not be tried, convicted, and jailed by Chinese courts. So, China was no longer fully sovereign over its own territory, even though it remained an independent country. This is also going to lead to warfare as the power relationships amongst these empires change. Now, you'll see that Japan is involved in 2 wars there in East Asia. The Russo-Japanese War happens in the Pacific part of the gigantic Russian Empire. Japan wins both of those wars. So part of saying that Japan succeeded during this time, part of that is based on the fact that they defeated 2 large countries in what at the time were surprising victories, fairly dramatic. The Balkans, when it says Balkan Wars, that involves the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans refers to the southeastern part of Europe. The Balkan Peninsula is a really thick, wide peninsula bordered by the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, and the Adriatic Sea. So it's like Greece and north of there. Well, during the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire lost territory to nationalist movements. So first Greece and later Serbia and Bulgaria and Romania became independent countries powered by nationalist movements that broke away from the Ottoman Empire. So you can see that as resistance to imperialism, resisting the Ottoman Empire. You can also see it as nationalism, creating new nation states. There's a lot of different things to pay attention to. Those Balkan Wars are going to set the stage for World War I, so they'll come up again in chapter 33. So here we have, so Japan became an industrialized imperialist power, but the other 3 were all threatened by imperialism from other countries, especially China and the Ottoman Empire. In the case of Russia, Russia was so large and had such a large population that they were still competing with the British for empire in Central Asia during this time. So again, we don't want to overdraw the point. These countries aren't helpless. In fact, they all still exist, China, Russia, and then the Ottoman Empire is Turkey. So again, don't overdraw the point, but they do face challenge from the countries that are more industrialized. In all 4 cases, the countries attempted to reform themselves. And so that's maybe one of the common themes here. Now, those reforms had varying degrees of success, but each country tried and attempted to reform themselves in a bid to maintain their traditional identity while competing in the modern world. And so each of these things would be evidence that a student could use in an essay or short answer question. So you should look for these to find them. They might even fit on flashcards. The Tanzamat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, which dealt with issues of government. The great reforms in Russia, the greatest of the great reforms would be the end of serfdom in the 1860s in Russia, which was meant to try to help Russia industrialize. Serfs are peasants who were bound to the land, could not leave the land that they worked on. And so in order to industrialize, Russian elites correctly put forth that they would have to free the serfs so that people could move to the city and become factory workers. Now, there were ways to industrialize without that happening, because some of the noble lords would transfer their serfs to the city or rent out their serfs, so there was still industrialization prior to this, but it was part of an attempt to industrialize. The Meiji Restoration in Japan is one of the most important events in the whole chapter. So if you were willing to put one of these things on a flashcard, I would recommend it be that, because that's part of Japan's change to becoming a imperialist industrial power. And of course, that's going to have a big effect on World War II and a smaller effect on World War I. It's an important piece of world history here. Self-strengthening is exactly what it sounds like in China. So trying to strengthen themselves by using traditional values, Neo-Confucianism, but also Western industrial technologies. Remember, a lot of the earliest industrial technology that the West adopted was things that had been done in China for centuries. So it's not like they were that far behind technologically, or even necessarily behind. It was just a matter of getting the business organization and the investment and applying the newest technologies. Technology changes so quickly, starting in the 1800s. A little bit, not quite as fast as today, but in that direction where things are always changing, that even though China not behind in any real sense in 1800, by 1880 definitely behind in terms of technological development. All these places will also see rebellions. The Meiji Restoration does involve a kind of palace rebellion, so it's not a widespread social movement. Two of these, the Taiping Rebellion and the Russian Revolution of 1905, are mass movements that involve tremendous casualties. The Taiping Rebellion actually costs more lives than World War One. It's because it goes on so long and it's in China with such a large population, and there's a lot of different pieces to it. The Meiji Restoration and the Young Turk movement are both more akin to coup d'etats, where there's a blow to the state, where it's not a massive social movement with thousands and thousands of people in the streets or in the field, or millions in the case of the Taiping Rebellion, but is more focused in the capital and amongst elites. But you can pay attention again to each of these things. One thing that I hope students watching this are noticing is that there's lots of pieces of evidence in this chapter. There's a lot of specific events, things with capital letters, reform movements, and you'll also find some individual people, all of whom could be used as evidence. As always in world history, you don't need to know all those things, but you really should know some of them. Okay. And then finally, the fourth key concept in this modern period, circa 1750 to the early 1900s, is about global migration, which becomes much larger, in part because of industrial capitalism, leads to bigger boats and greater labor needs and new locations for businesses. So you'll see that here. Also, this time period involved the abolition of slavery in the 1800s, and so agricultural production, like plantations in places like the Caribbean that had relied on enslaved labor, began to look for labor from other sources. And so we get the movement of indentured laborers from China and Japan, and also India, although that's going to be in another chapter, moving to new locations. And also people migrating as wage workers, free laborers, to places in the Americas and in the settler colonies in Oceania, like Australia. All right. Enjoy your reading of Societies at the Crossroads. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.